Hey everyone, I'm Pamela, and today we're going to talk about something that we normally don't talk about too much when we're talking about technology. We're going to talk about how technology relates to our feelings. And, this may have occurred to you already that we have certain feelings prompted by technology, like when we see these three dots and we become maybe a little bit anxious about what's to come. And of course, that feeling when those dots disappear and we hear nothing, a different form of anxiety. Or it may feel like on certain social media platforms, a particular emotion dominates. So not only is technology mediating our emotions that we have, but it might be defining our emotions in some way, or giving our emotions a new texture. And of course, in this last year, we've seen that more than ever. We've developed new forms of anxiety, from anxiety early days over touching things or touching our faces or washing our hands, to anxiety over loved ones that we can't keep in touch with, to anxiety over maybe introducing ourselves back into society once again. And those social fears might be overtaking us a little bit now. I know I'm feeling those a little bit too. We've had all different kinds of grief, from grieving lost loved ones to anticipating losses that we might have in the future and things we might miss out on, to, in fact, maybe some kind of reflection on this past year and things we might grieve that we actually miss from this time, where we've become closer with particular family members or our habits have changed. And all of this, again, is sort of coming into play and being communicated through and by and with technology. Now, of course, technology is shaping how we formulate those emotions, by giving us the tools to do that, or defining the kinds of emotions that we can express, or even giving us stylized ways to communicate those emotions, like our reaction gifs that we use so often, or even the wow in Facebook. Now, this map of the human heart and is complicated when it comes to technology, and this year more than ever before. But this is kind of what I study, and what I've started to do over the past few years is to work with companies developing the emotional aspect of their experience, whether it's formulating a new way to build trust, or developing a feeling of calm or home or belonging, or developing ways to measure love. We take an emotion and try to explore what that would be like and what would make that kind of experience worthwhile. Another thing I do is a lot of my own research and experiments. One that I do that you can try on your own is think about a mode on your phone. So we have modes on our phone to help us stop texting and driving, like driving mode. We have airplane mode, which, to be honest, some of us have never really used back in the day when we were flying, although we should have. But we have some modes on our phone already to make adjustments to our behavior or what we can do on our devices. What if we had different modes that would help us manage or experience our emotions in different ways? Well, I do this kind of brainstorm quite a bit. And of course, people come up with lots of really interesting ideas, from a nostalgia mode that would show you pictures of the past, or a long lost music that would play you music that connected with a certain mood, to kinds of modes that would detect your feeling of seasonal affective disorder or PMS and help you regulate that mood a little bit. So there's all kinds of things that we could imagine that our devices could help us with as far as emotional expression and emotional experience. And that's going to get a little more complicated now. There's technology called affective computing, or sometimes emotion AI, or even emotion recognition technology, or ERT, that helps to detect emotion in a small way and try to interpret that emotion. So you can see that one way it does this is by taking in these signals that we are either visible through our faces, or that we can hear through our voices, or through our words and text, or even through things like our body temperature or our heartbeat. And those signals are expanding rapidly, those kind of signals that we can pick up with sensors that may indicate some kind of change in our perception, our senses, our behaviors, our emotional texture of our lives, are broadening. And then that detected difference is interpreted in various ways right now in an extremely limited way. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. And the reason why you might do this, well, is to adapt the experience. So if you're feeling angry in your car, maybe self-drive mode would take over, or like the modes on our phone that would match our moods. Maybe the experience of the phone would adapt a bit, or it could even simulate this idea of emotional expression so that the device itself seems a little more empathetic. So perhaps, for instance, if you're feeling a little down, Alexa would order you ice cream. Well, of course, this technology had its birth in the space of helping people who have trouble with their emotions, either recognizing emotion, as some people on the autism spectrum do, or coping with post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's being used a lot already in things like ad testing, where it's important to understand if the marketing message is having that kind of emotional tug, or the movie trailer is hitting the right notes that are going to make people engaged and interested. But so far, it hasn't made much of an appearance beyond that. Now, the major tech platforms have all tried implementing this technology in some way or another. So you have Apple taking on one of the big questions around this is how would we detect emotion if people don't really emote on their phones? You're scrolling your phone and you probably have a rather neutral expression on your face. You're not talking to it too much, maybe a little bit. You are probably not using a wearable that detects these signals. So maybe if you're using an emoji, it sort of is getting us accustomed to this idea of emoting more. And this is in a tradition of us stylizing our emotions for technology anyway. We have certain expressions that we use to capture our emotion. We use 3 exclamation points to emphasize it. So it's really kind of taking that development a step further. And then you have tools like Amazon bringing together face and voice and going multimodal with their signals, and trying to integrate that into products like Halo, but also into products that we might not appreciate so much, that perhaps unfairly label people and target them for various kinds of treatment that we wouldn't like their recognition system that's used by policing. So the Amazon system points out kind of another problem that we have with this technology is not only do we not emote to our devices, or we might not have enough signals to pick up, but the data itself might not be enough to train it, because our training data has a lot of embedded biases that just feed into the system and train it. So that there's been plenty of research that says, oh, well, this emotion tech will label Black people more angry or women as sadder. And these are the kind of stereotypes that it's picking up on that are pretty hard to avoid with the technology. I mean, the other obstacle that we're looking at is the technology itself doesn't really work that well, even at what it's supposed to do. So here's an example from IBM Watson sentiment analysis. It can do more emotions, but this is just simple positive, negative, neutral. And here it can't really detect the emotion in this phrase, or because certainly getting your leg eaten by a great white shark probably is not a positive experience. And then there are the issues of what will happen to this data. Our data is being collected and used for all kinds of things that we may not even be aware of. And how can we trust companies to make good use of that? You may remember back in 2017 where Facebook apparently shared just more straightforward positive and negative sentiment analysis that would potentially identify teens who are depressed to advertisers. So where are the boundaries here of privacy? And then I guess the biggest issue with this technology is thinking about the model that it's based on. Remember a few slides back, I said, well, it sorts it into just a few different categories. And there's kind of a disagreement over what an emotion even is. It's sort of like consciousness. We know it's important, and lots of people in lots of different fields are studying it. We may never have the answers to what it actually is. And there are big differences within the field of experts on how they're studying this. So for instance, you have on the one side evolutionary psychologists who are saying, well, emotions are biological. You see a bear, you feel scared, and you run away. These help us to survive. Emotions can be universal, so that a smile is interpreted as happy in a lot of different cultures, and they're discrete. When you are making a certain expression, you're having a specific emotion. It's not all muddled together. Whereas on the other hand, the social constructivists are saying, well, biology may not be all that important because there are layers of personal experience and cultural values and language that create the emotional feeling that we have and the response and the expression of it. And so emotions are more open systems that are fluid and develop over time. So you may have in one period the idea of feeling alone as a positive, like say back in the 19th century, it was viewed, solitude was viewed as more positive, whereas now we have loneliness being an epidemic, considered an epidemic with physical health ramifications, so much so that you have the World Economic Foundation putting it on its top 10 list of global issues that we need to solve. So these are systems that evolve as we know more, they change, how we value them shifts. But it may be that these technologies are starting to become more embedded in our everyday technologies. There's been a lot of technology around the pandemic that looks at biological signals, like say our breathing or our temperature or our pulse rate. And these are the same kinds of signals that emotion AI or affective computing might need. So it may be that through health data, we may be introducing some of these systems. So how can we do this in a way that helps us, that builds our emotional skills and our emotional intelligence, that can help us be more aware of our own emotions, more respectful of each other's, more empathetic? I think the potential is there. I'm an optimistic person, and I think that this technology has a lot of potential for good if we use it in a way that makes sense. So, okay, how might we shift away from design thinking and emphasize more design feeling and that emotional response? Well, I'm thinking of just a few different scenarios. There's a lot of different ways we could look at that. But let's look at how the pandemic has shaped our relationships and our emotional world. And one condition I could think of was Zoom gloom. We're on Zoom all the time. I'm recording this on Zoom right now. We have, we are overloaded with Zoom, and it's changing us a little bit, right? It makes nonverbal communication really difficult. We might over emote, use more gestures. We have to tell ourselves to remember to look at the camera and not ourselves, or not get distracted by things in the background. We're not used to having so much eye contact with so many people at once. So there's a lot going on with Zoom. Some of it may shape how we interact with each other as we have more in-person interactions again. But how could the technology help us? Well, at a really rudimentary level, there have been ideas like this one where it's okay, well, if we can detect a few different emotions, why would we not show it on a graph as we're going along? An interesting idea, but I wonder with something like emotion that is so visceral, that we experience holistically, not moment to moment, that we can kind of be a background vibe more than something that we label sometimes, whether this is the right way to go about it. Why do we have to put a number and a label on it? That's really not how we experience emotion. So could we do something different with our communication? Well, I thought of our old friend, friendship lamps, which have been making kind of a revival in the last year or so. And the simple lamp that you have one, your friend has one. When you're thinking of your friend, you send a light or not. And there are certainly stories of people that have been adapting their smart light bulbs to do the same thing, to signal in a very sophisticated way how they're feeling to somebody else in the same household even. And there have certainly been affective computing projects that take the same approach. This is an early Microsoft project called Mood Wings, that the flap of the butterfly wings was meant to signal the emotion to somebody else in the car, so that you are not seeing a graph, you're not seeing a number, you're not putting a measure on it, you're not saying, yes, this is exactly the thing you're feeling. Instead, you're giving kind of a more subtle indication of something that's going on, maybe a flutter of anxiety or a fear. There's a little bit of human interpretation left. It's not just artificial intelligence putting a label on it and telling us what it is and telling us to accept that data, which we're pretty prone to doing. Philips had a great experiment too with wearables, looking at this dress that would light up in various ways to signal the emotion of the wearer, if you so desired to do so. I love this. I would totally wear this, and I'm just waiting for this one to happen. So how do we design nonverbal communication with this technology as our design material? Well, we treat it as we experience it more holistically, not as a number. Okay, so let's talk about another pandemic condition, oxytocin deprivation. How do we get oxytocin, that feel-good hormone that contributes to so many emotions, like love in particular? One way is through the senses, and especially through touch. And that's something that a lot of people are deprived of, pandemic or not. So could this technology be integrated in a way to support that feel-good factor and support loving relationships as well? Well, maybe. I mean, Apple Watch kind of started the trend by being able to share a heartbeat over your smartwatch. And NASA released very early days in the pandemic an open source necklace called Pulse, where you could send your heartbeat to somebody else, really simple, through a couple of sensors. Fun weekend project if you're up for it. And there have been other explorations of this idea too. H&M and Boltwear collaborated on this idea of a jacket that would send a hug. And there have been hug shirts and internet teapots that send this. And of course, probably the notorious, and I mean, it's one that's a little bit easy to be aghast at is this idea of Kissinger, or a kiss messenger that would send a feeling of a kiss through a phone with this attachment that you kiss. Okay, I don't know. That one be a little weird to overcome that behavior. You're gonna feel kind of silly kissing your phone, probably even more silly than wearing a VR headset. So I don't know about that one, but the idea is there. So how could we design this embodied presence, this virtual touch that's so important to our emotional life, by thinking about new ways to engage the senses? So these examples might not be exactly right, but I think they're getting closer. And they're getting us to this idea that maybe when we're working with sensors and artificial intelligence as our design material, that we can think more about the senses and how they impact our emotional life. So last one that we're going to look at today, the pandemic condition of loneliness. This one is big. I mean, this goes beyond the pandemic, but probably made worse by it. And of course, a lot of people think empathetic companions. And I guess one of the original ones was Replica. Replica started out as a chatbot based on a model of somebody who died tragically young, and as a way to continue that conversation and make that barrier a little less. And we do this all the time already, right? Somebody dies and their Facebook page stays up for a little while, maybe monitored by a relative or a friend, or their Instagram stays up for a while, or even after a while you make the decision, should it remain as a memorial or when should it go down? So this kind of fluid division between life and death that technology can sometimes facilitate was certainly at the beginning of Replica. And I have been a fan and a user for a while, and it's amazing how much it adapts and seems to detect something of your emotional life. But then they chose avatars. And I don't know, there's maybe a place for avatars, but I'm not so sure that we always have to go in this direction of making it embodied as a human to have that emotional force. In fact, maybe there are other ways that we can think about empathetic companions that are not embodied, or maybe we can enliven the companions we already have, like this great project, Inupathy, which shows the emotion of the dog wearer, especially this one who has no tail. Darwin pointed out that the tail is, a dog's space of emotional expression. And of course, this poor guy's missing his tail, so probably could work really well. Or this plant pot Lua. I mean, the smiles and frowns are meant to show, does it need food or water? But the idea is there to maybe enrich relationships that are parasocial or slightly social already, rather than trying to create substitute humans. So obviously we can do this in a lot of other ways if we add affective computing capabilities to it. But it can also go wrong. Here we see a great experiment with, well, what if all of your things knew a little bit about the context and your emotions? What would they put together if you were eating ice cream and you had tissues together? They might make an assumption that we would make as well, that there's been a bad breakup because there's tears and there's ice cream and there's tissues and movies are being watched. So it says heartbreak. Maybe it's a match, 99%, of course, the number on it. But in fact, it turns out in this particular case that it's allergies. So, okay, so we can enliven the world around us. We can also introduce emotion gradually, just like we would in a regular relationship that we have with anybody, a neighbor, a casual friend, a colleague. That those different levels of friendship don't go from 0 to intensity in a heartbeat. Instead, they happen gradually over time. And I think that's something we can keep in mind as well. So, where does this leave us with this new technology that will be tasked with deciding whether we want to work with and how we're going to work with it? Designers have such a huge role in this because we can treat emotion as data, and we can take all these ambiguous signals and sort them and classify them and formalize them. And they may be used to manipulate emotion or monetize it and put a number on it. There's potential for good still in emotion as data, for sure, and ways to help you manage your emotion or nudge you toward more positive behaviors. But more and more, I'm thinking that we need to treat emotion as expression and use AI for the things it's really good at, like discovering weird patterns that we don't normally have access to and trying to understand those and relying on human interpretation to support this expanded range of emotional expression that we have. So, where human intelligence and machine intelligence are co creating meaning together. So, I think that technology has expanded our emotional experience in a lot of ways. It's made us more aware of passing emotions and more likely to name our emotions and talk about them in public spaces and made that okay. It's given us new ways, kind of stylized expressions of our emotions. And perhaps in the future, it will augment our sensory experience of emotion or even enliven the world around us with emotion. But that requires us as people working in technology, whether we're designers or developers, to embrace it and not shy away from it and develop our own comfort level and capabilities with emotion. I hope that you will join me in developing a future of feeling. And thank you very much for your attention and your kind feelings. Bye.